Your job is not your identity. Life lessons after 80 on purpose, retirement, and self-worth. If you enjoyed the content, please consider subscribing and liking the video. It truly helps the channel grow and continue to create contents like this. When I was younger, I used to introduce myself the way people hand over a business card, name first, title second, and everything else tucked neatly behind those two words, like a coat on a hook. I was proud of it. The title sounded like proof that my hours meant something, that my choices had weight, that the world could point at me and say, yes, he belongs here. At 82, the world doesn't ask for my title anymore. The grocery clerk asks if I found everything. The nurse asks if I'm drinking enough water. The neighbor asks if the snowblower started this morning. Nobody asks what I do. And the first time that happened, really happened, when the questions stopped arriving like clockwork, I felt something in me go quiet. Not peaceful quiet. Unsettling quiet. Like a room after the music has been turned off and you realize you don't know what to do with your hands. I remember a particular afternoon in my late 50s. I was still working, still running hard, still wearing the suit like armor. A young man in the elevator recognized me, nodded with that eager respect you can hear before you can see it, and said my title out loud as if it were my first name. I smiled because of course I did. I let it land on me like sunlight. And then the elevator doors opened, and he stepped out, and the warmth faded so quickly it was almost embarrassing. I stared at my reflection in the metal panel and thought, quietly, what happens when he doesn't know my title? That question followed me for years. I ignored it the way you ignore a tiny warning light on the dashboard. The car still runs. The meeting is still on the calendar. The mortgage still needs paying. And the title, well, the title makes the world easier to navigate. People return your calls. People take notes when you speak. People laugh at jokes that aren't funny. You start believing that the laughter means you are funny, not that you are powerful. And power is a tricky mirror. It reflects back whatever you want to see. I watched a friend of mine retire at 65. He'd been somebody. The kind of somebody whose signature moved money and whose opinion could shift a room. On his last day, they threw him a party. Cake, speeches, a framed plaque with his name etched so neatly it looked permanent. He took pictures with everyone, shook hands until his knuckles looked swollen, and he kept smiling as if he could store the attention for later. The next Monday, he put on a collared shirt anyway. He drove downtown anyway. He wandered the streets near his old office and bought himself a coffee he didn't want, just to stand somewhere familiar. When he told me about it, he laughed like it was a joke. But his eyes didn't laugh. What he was really haunting was a version of himself that had been propped up by everyone else's need for him. That's what jobs can do, if we're not careful. They can give us a shape that feels solid, and we start mistaking the shape for the soul. We start attaching our worth to our usefulness, and our usefulness to our profession, and our profession to a title printed in bold on a badge. Then one day the badge goes in a drawer, and the drawer closes, and you realize you've been living as a label. I'm not here to shame work. Work is honest. Work can be beautiful. Work can be service. Work can be a craft that teaches you patience, sharpens your mind, feeds your family, gives you pride. But work is not a substitute for being known. It is not a substitute for being loved. It is not a substitute for knowing yourself when nobody is applauding. When we say, your job is not your identity, it sounds like a slogan. Something you'd print on a mug. But it's actually a warning, and also a promise. The warning is this: if you rent your identity from your job, the lease can end without notice. A layoff, an illness, an industry that changes, a retirement date you thought you controlled. The promise is this: you are larger than what you produce. The first time I truly felt that promise was not in a triumph. It was in a loss. I was forced into a slower life earlier than I expected. A stubborn health issue, not dramatic, just persistent enough to remind me that I wasn't in charge of everything. I took leave. I stayed home. And for a few weeks I acted like I was on vacation, like I would return to the old rhythm soon. But the days have a way of telling the truth. You wake up, and the phone doesn't ring. You drink your coffee, and no one needs your decision. You walk past a mirror, and you look like yourself, but you don't feel like yourself. You feel like a man standing outside his own life, peeking through the glass. At first, I tried to replace my job with busyness. I cleaned the garage. I reorganized the kitchen drawers. I made elaborate lists because lists feel like progress. But the quiet kept widening, and in that widening I could hear an older question: who are you when you are not being measured? Because jobs measure you constantly. Deadlines, reviews, targets, numbers, praise, criticism. Even the absence of feedback is feedback. You learn to stand straight in the spotlight. You learn to chase the next nod. You learn to fear the frown. And if you've done it long enough, you start carrying the measuring tape into your own home. You measure your evenings. You measure your weekends. You measure your worth by how full your calendar is. Retirement, or any pause, takes the tape away. That's why so many people feel untethered when they stop working. It isn't only about money, though money matters. It's about the sudden disappearance of external scaffolding. Without the daily structure, without the small affirmations, without the urgency that told you were needed, you have to face the plain fact of yourself. And that can be frightening if you've been using your job to avoid that face. I've seen it in men who were raised to believe they were only as good as their paycheck. I've seen it in women who carried entire departments on their backs and then felt guilty the moment they stopped. I've seen it in people who wore their profession like a medal and then, in retirement, wandered like they'd lost their uniform. The solution isn't to pretend work doesn't matter. The solution is to build an identity that work can't take away. If you're listening and you're still in the thick of it, still commuting, still grinding, try this. When someone asks about your day, answer with one thing you noticed that made you feel human. A smell, a light, a laugh. Something no title can own. Another exercise: ask yourself who would still call you if you had nothing to offer. Not nothing to give as a human being, nothing to offer as a professional. If that list feels small, don't panic. Just see it. Then start investing in relationships that aren't built on your usefulness. Invite someone to coffee without talking shop. Learn to be present without performing. And learn to let yourself be ordinary. That last one is hard. I know. When you've been praised for being exceptional, ordinary feels like a demotion. But ordinary is where life actually happens. Ordinary is breakfast, a quiet laugh, a familiar chair, the hand you reach for in the dark, the way you show up when no one is watching. In my own retirement, I had to mourn the version of me that could walk into a room and be recognized. I had to admit that I enjoyed that recognition, maybe more than I should have. I had to admit that sometimes I used my work as a way to avoid intimacy. Because intimacy can't be controlled the way a project plan can be controlled. Then, slowly, something else began to grow. I started cooking meals that took time. Not to impress anyone, just to feel the quiet pleasure of chopping vegetables, of hearing the pan sizzle, of feeding someone I love. I started taking long walks with no destination. I started talking with my grandchildren in a way that wasn't a lecture or a schedule, but a curiosity. I started sitting with my wife in the evening without the television, just listening to the sounds of the house settling, and noticing the way her presence filled the room better than a promotion ever did. And here is the strange part: as the professional identity faded, my actual self got louder. Not louder in the sense of ego. Louder in the sense of clarity. I remembered what I cared about before I learned what I was supposed to care about. I remembered the boy I was, the one who liked fixing things with his hands, who liked telling stories, who liked making people laugh without needing an agenda. If you never give yourself space to meet that person again, retirement can feel like emptiness. But if you begin meeting yourself now, while you're still working, while the title still hangs from your neck like a shiny charm, then retirement can feel like returning home. Your job can be a chapter. It can even be a long chapter. But it cannot be the whole book. When the title disappears, what remains should not be a blank page. It should be the threads you've been weaving all along: your character, your kindness, your curiosity, your faithfulness to the people you love, your willingness to learn, your ability to sit with discomfort without running back to the office to drown it out. If you build those threads now, then the day you step away from the job, you won't feel like a ghost. You'll feel like a person. It was my last day. Not the last day on earth, not the last day of love, just the last day in that building where I'd spent so many mornings thinking I was indispensable. The hallway smelled like carpet cleaner and old coffee. The light over the copy machine flickered like it always had, as if even the bulbs were tired. I walked to my desk and it looked smaller than I remembered, like the years had been shrinking it in secret. I put my things in a box the way you see in movies, except in real life it isn't dramatic. It's ordinary. A stapler. A mug with a crack in the handle. A notebook filled with plans that would never be finished by me. A framed photo of my family that, for years, had been my reminder to go home. I kept picking things up and realizing how many of them were props. Evidence. Proof that I belong. Then someone came by and said something kind, and I thanked them, and we did that careful dance people do around endings. And then the last handshake happened. The last joke. The last. Keep in touch. And suddenly I was walking out to the parking lot with a box in my arms and the sun on my face, and a strange, almost embarrassing thought arrived: the world did not pause. The doors didn't lock behind me like a verdict. The sky didn't change color. Cars still moved, birds still argued in the trees, and some kid somewhere was laughing so hard he couldn't breathe. That moment hit me like both grief and relief. Grief, because I had spent so long trying to matter in the way my job defined mattering. Relief, because I realized I didn't have to earn my right to exist anymore. The title had been a costume I forgot I was wearing, and now that it was gone, I could finally breathe through my ribs. But breathing is only the beginning. After you stop working, you also stop hiding. That's the part nobody says out loud at the retirement party. The first week I woke up early anyway. My body was trained. I sat at the kitchen table with my coffee and listened to the refrigerator hum. I checked my phone out of habit, expecting a crisis to be waiting, a decision that only I could make. Nothing. I walked to the window and watched a delivery truck pull away from a neighbor's house. I tried to feel grateful, and I did, but underneath the gratitude there was a restlessness that didn't know where to put itself. So I did what many people do. I tried to turn retirement into another job. I made schedules. I set goals. I looked for ways to feel important. I volunteered for committees where I could have a title again. I offered advice too quickly. I corrected people at the hardware store. I chuckle now, but at the time it was desperate. I wasn't trying to be annoying. I was trying to stay visible to myself. One afternoon my wife looked at me, really looked at me, and said softly, "You don't have to audition anymore." That sentence might have saved me. Because that's what work can become if we let it, an endless audition. You perform competence. You perform confidence. You perform certainty. You perform strength. And after a while you forget where the performance ends and you begin. You bring the costume home and you wear it at the dinner table. You wear it with your kids. You wear it with your friends. And then, when the job ends, you're left standing in front of a mirror holding an outfit you're not sure how to put down. If you're still working, here's the life lesson I wish I'd learned sooner: start practicing now, in small ways, how to put the costume down at the end of the day. It can be simple. Walk into your home and touch something, your door frame, your coat hook, and let that be your ritual of return. Say, even silently, "I am home now. I am not my job in this room." Another practice. Let yourself be bad at something again. Take up a hobby where nobody applauds you. Learn a musical instrument and sound awful for a while. Plant tomatoes and watch half of them die. Try painting and discover your hands don't obey your vision. It is humbling, yes, but it also is freedom. It reminds you that your worth is not attached to mastery. It is attached to being alive. And here's one more: tell the people you love who you are without your resume. Not your accomplishments, your values. Your fears. Your hopes. The stories that shaped you before you had a job title to hide behind. Ask them who they see when they look at you. If that question scares you, that's a sign you need it. Retirement has a way of stripping you down to what you built underneath the career. Some people discover they built a sturdy foundation: friendships, curiosity, generosity, play. Others discover they built a beautiful office on sand. And the sand isn't shameful, but it is revealing. I watched another friend struggle in retirement, not because he missed the work, but because he didn't know how to be with himself. He'd never learned how to sit still without feeling guilty. When the phone stopped ringing, he started inventing reasons to be busy, and then he grew resentful that no one was grateful for his invented busyness. It was like watching someone try to refill a well with a teaspoon. So I'll tell you what finally helped me refill mine. I began by paying attention to the parts of me that had been waiting politely in the background. The part that liked reading slowly. The part that liked fixing a loose hinge without telling anyone. The part that loved listening to old music and letting it bring back faces I thought I'd forgotten. I started calling old friends without an agenda. I started asking questions, not giving answers. I started saying, "I don't know," and letting that be true. And the more I did that, the more I realized the job is only one way to be useful. You can be useful as a neighbor. You can be useful as a friend. You can be useful as a parent who finally has time to listen. You can be useful as the person who brings soup when someone is sick. You can be useful as the one who tells the truth gently. You can be useful as a witness to someone else's life. But even usefulness is not the center. Love is. I learned that most clearly at a funeral. The man had held an impressive position. People used to say it the way you say a badge of honor. But in the service program, the title appeared in small letters under his name, and nobody lingered on it. What filled the room was stories: how he stopped to help a stranger in the rain, how he carried his daughter on his shoulders at a county fair, how he called a coworker's son after a rough diagnosis, just to tell the kid he mattered. On the drive home, I asked myself, if I vanished tomorrow, what would people say about me? Would they mention my promotions or my patience? My meetings or my mercy? That question didn't shame me. It aimed me. I decided to live for the stories that sound like love. Not because work is unimportant, but because it isn't what survives. When you separate your identity from your profession, you don't become smaller. You become wider. You stop living in a single lane. You start noticing that you have many names: spouse, friend, mentor, sibling, learner, helper, artist, gardener, storyteller, quiet companion. And none of those names require a paycheck. I want to speak to the younger version of me for a moment, and maybe to you too. The title will not hug you when you're scared. The title will not sit beside you in a hospital room. The title will not remember your laugh. The title will not forgive you when you've been wrong. People will. Or they would, if you let them close enough. That's why, if you're building a life right now, build it with people at the center, not the job. Let the job support the life, not swallow it. Take the vacation. Go to the recital. Eat dinner without checking email. Sit on the floor and play a silly game even when your mind insists you should be productive. Those moments will outlast your business card. And if you are already retired, and you feel a little hollow, please don't treat that hollowness as a failure. Treat it as space. Space is where you can plant new things. Start with one small act that has nothing to do with achievement. Sit outside for 10 minutes and notice the air. Write one honest paragraph about what you're afraid of. Call someone and ask them about their day, then really listen. Make something with your hands. Forgive an old grudge. Learn a new recipe. Walk to the corner and back with no need to justify it. Because the truth is, titles disappear, but you remain. The question is, what kind of you have you been feeding? When I finally stopped trying to be impressive, I became more present. My conversations got slower. My laughter came easier. My apologies came sooner. I stopped measuring my days by output and started measuring them by connection. And I found, to my surprise, that I was not less valuable. I was simply valuable in a way that couldn't be printed. So tonight, wherever you are, imagine setting your title on a table the way you set down your keys. Picture walking away from it, not as a loss, but as a release. You can pick it up tomorrow if you need to. But for a few hours, let yourself be nobody important. Let yourself be a person. And if you practice that long enough, the day you truly step away, from the office, from the uniform, from the role, won't feel like falling off a cliff. It will feel like stepping into a room you've been decorating for years, finally turning on the light, and recognizing yourself.